At 10:15 on the morning of April 9, 1943, Captain Alexander Pokryshkin climbed into the cockpit of his P-39 Airacobra at a forward airfield near Krymskaya in southern Russia, preparing for the flight that would begin rewriting the reputation of an aircraft almost everyone else had already declared a failure. The fighter beneath him was American-built, ferried across 2 oceans, rejected by the British, dismissed by American squadrons, and written off as a hopeless machine by nearly every Western pilot who had tried to fly it. And now, these unwanted hand-me-downs were being delivered to Soviet frontline regiments, where men like Pokryshkin were expected to take them into battle against the Luftwaffe's finest. Just 24 hours earlier, he had been told the new American fighters were arriving soon, part of the Lend-Lease shipments. The British had tested them and refused to keep them. The Americans had tried them in the Pacific and couldn't replace them fast enough. Now they were being shipped to Russia, the final recipients in a chain of disappointment stretching across half the world. Pokryshkin had flown the Yak-1 and MiG-3 for 2 years, both capable Soviet fighters, able to fight Messerschmitts at low and medium altitudes, but both plagued by unreliable radios, guns that jammed at the worst moments, and engines that failed when survival depended on them performing flawlessly. The new American machine, by contrast, carried with it a reputation like a curse. British pilots called it dangerous. American pilots said it climbed like a brick, couldn't dogfight at altitude, and couldn't reach the heights needed to intercept Japanese bombers. One joke in the Pacific claimed the P-400, the export version, was just a P-39 with a 0 on its tail. The reason for the aircraft's terrible reputation went back to a crucial engineering decision made years earlier. When the prototype flew in 1938, it had a turbocharger that gave it superb high-altitude performance. It could reach 20,000 feet in 5 minutes, nearly matching the best fighters of the era. But in 1939, after aerodynamic testing revealed the turbo installation caused drag, Bell Aircraft proposed removing the turbo entirely. That decision crippled the aircraft's ability to fight above 15,000 feet. Without a turbocharger, the Allison engine suffocated on thin air. Performance collapsed. Above 20,000 feet, the P-39 was almost useless. And for British and American air forces planning to escort bombers at 25,000 feet, that single limitation made the aircraft unacceptable. British pilots testing the P-400 in 1941 immediately rejected it, complaining about poor high-altitude handling and a frightening tendency to enter flat spins due to its rear-mounted engine and shifting center of gravity. Americans brought the P-39 to the Pacific in early 1942 and quickly discovered it couldn't reach Japanese bombers. Climb rate vanished above 15,000 feet, controls went mushy, and Zeros danced around them with infuriating ease. Lieutenant Evan Stevens remembered the humiliation of scrambling to intercept a Japanese raid and watching the bombers glide overhead, far above where his struggling engine would allow him to reach. Even the aircraft's signature 37mm cannon, mounted in the nose, proved unreliable. It jammed, fired slowly, and its shells dropped like bricks in flight, forcing pilots to close dangerously short to have any chance of hitting anything. By the end of 1942, American pilots were fed up with the Iron Dog, as they called it. Only one American pilot, William Fiedler, ever became an ace in the aircraft, and he died not in glorious combat, but in a freak accident when a P-38 crashed into his parked P-39 on the ground. His death seemed symbolic, the aircraft's lone American ace killed by an aircraft that wasn't even the enemy's. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were eager to replace the P-39 with P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. The Airacobra seemed destined for the scrap heap of failed designs. But on the other side of the world, in the brutal and chaotic air war over the Eastern Front, everything was different. When the first P-400s arrived in Murmansk via Arctic convoy in late 1941, Soviet pilots expected disaster. They had heard the horror stories from the British and Americans. Their first test flights confirmed the aircraft's flat-spin tendencies when flown with an empty ammunition bay, a discovery that stunned American observers. Yet Soviet pilots also noticed something else, something the British and Americans had overlooked entirely. Below 15,000 feet, the aircraft was a different machine. At low and medium altitudes, the Allison engine produced excellent power. The P-39 rolled fast, turned tightly, accelerated well, and offered superb visibility from its bubble canopy. And most importantly, it had a radio that actually worked. For the Soviets, this changed everything. Most of their fighters had radios that barely functioned, if they had radios at all. Flying in coordinated formations had been nearly impossible earlier in the war. But inside the American cockpit, Soviet pilots heard each other with perfect clarity, as if they were standing side by side. They could warn each other of incoming fighters, coordinate attacks, switch roles mid-battle, and operate with discipline the Luftwaffe had not yet seen from the Red Air Force. The P-39 suddenly wasn't just a fighter, it was a tactical revolution. The firepower was no less impressive. The 37mm cannon, unreliable in jungle conditions, worked far better in Soviet hands. Their mechanics maintained weapons obsessively, prioritizing reliability. Pilots adapted their tactics, learning to fire from closer range and mastering the cannon's unique trajectory. The two synchronized .50 caliber machine guns in the nose served as precise aiming tools, walking fire toward the target before the cannon fired the killing shot. Soviet regiments removed the wing-mounted .30 caliber guns to improve roll rate and reduce weight, a modification that instantly made the aircraft more nimble and better balanced. This kind of field adaptation was routine in the Soviet military, where mechanics were encouraged to modify aircraft based on combat experience. In contrast, American mechanics were required to follow strict technical orders, making similar field adjustments nearly impossible. And the Eastern Front itself was the perfect environment for the aircraft Western pilots had despised. Air combat over Russia rarely occurred above 15,000 feet. Ground battles, tank assaults, and artillery duels meant aircraft operated at low to medium altitudes, exactly where the P-39 excelled. German bombers flew low, Stukas even lower, and their escorts stayed with them. Suddenly, the P-39 had found its natural battlefield. In the hands of Soviet pilots, it became something entirely different from the airplane American and British pilots had cursed. Bringing the aircraft to the Soviet Union was its own saga. P-39s began life in New York, flew to Montana, then were ferried north by male and female pilots alike before being handed to Soviet aviators in Alaska. From there, the aircraft flew the dangerous Alaska-Siberia route across frozen ocean and desolate tundra. Many pilots vanished into storms that swallowed fighters whole. But those who survived delivered the machines that would become legends in Soviet regiments. No one showcased the aircraft's potential more than Alexander Pokryshkin. By early 1943, he was already one of the Soviet Union's top pilots, aggressive, analytical, and constantly refining tactics. When his regiment transitioned to the P-39, he studied every characteristic of the aircraft and devised tactics that exploited its strengths. One of his most famous innovations was the bookshelf formation, a stacked, layered arrangement of fighters, each one supporting the layer below it. The formation offered unmatched flexibility and coverage, exploiting the P-39's radio to coordinate attacks in real time. Pokryshkin also collaborated with Soviet radar crews, pioneering radar-guided intercepts that allowed his pilots to position themselves behind German formations before they were even seen. On April 9, 1943, Pokryshkin scored his first kill in the P-39, tearing apart a Messerschmitt with cannon shells that ripped up the fuselage and exploded the engine in a spray of black smoke. 3 days later he shot down 4 German fighters in a single mission, using the bookshelf formation to outmaneuver and outcommunicate the enemy. In just 3 weeks, he claimed 12 victories in the aircraft Western pilots had given up on. On April 29th, he took part in one of the most famous engagements of the war. 8 Airacobras diving into 3 entire squadrons of Stukas and their escorts, shooting down 12 German aircraft without losing a single Soviet fighter. His reputation spread quickly. German radio intercepts began warning Luftwaffe pilots whenever Pokryshkin, identified by the call sign Sotka, meaning 100, the number painted on his aircraft, was airborne. Some units were ordered to avoid combat entirely if he was in the area. The Luftwaffe had never reacted this way to a single pilot before, let alone one flying an aircraft they had once dismissed as inferior. Pokryshkin's closest wingman, Grigory Rechkalov, became another master of the Airacobra. A man who should have been disqualified from flying due to color blindness, he hid his condition and flew anyway. After being wounded early in the war, he returned stronger, scoring dozens of victories in P-39s and eventually earning the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Rechkalov's aggressiveness meshed perfectly with the Airacobra's low-altitude strengths. He scored 44 of his 56 victories in P-39s, many of them in aircraft he flew for months at a time, carefully maintained by mechanics who knew exactly how he liked his machine to handle. Other Soviet pilots began achieving similar results. Nikolai Gyulov, a natural marksman, used the P-39's heavy nose armament with ruthless precision, closing to point-blank range before firing. Dmitry Glinka, a methodical tactician, analyzed German habits and used the P-39 strengths to exploit them repeatedly. Alexander Klubb scored 31 of his victories in the aircraft. Ivan Babik became famous for his extraordinary eyesight, spotting German fighters at extreme distances and guiding his formation into perfect intercepts thanks to the P-39's reliable radio. Again and again the pattern repeated. The aircraft Western pilots hated became the weapon Soviet pilots used to dominate the skies. By war's end the numbers spoke for themselves. The Soviet Union received 4,719 P-39s, nearly half of all the P-39s ever built. They lost more than 1,000 in combat, but shot down far more German aircraft in return. Half of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces scored most of their victories in this one aircraft. The kill ratios soared. German pilots began reporting that Soviet fighters were suddenly fighting with better coordination, better aggression, and better tactics. They examined crashed P-39s and saw the modifications, but never understood the real advantage: the synergy between Soviet tactics, Soviet creativity, and an American airplane that had finally found the one battlefield where it was perfect. The P-39 story is one of the most dramatic turnarounds in aviation history. Rejected by the nations that built it, transformed by the nation that needed it most, it became a symbol of adaptation and ingenuity. And on that morning in April 1943, when Captain Alexander Pokryshkin climbed into the cockpit of his Airacobra, he wasn't just preparing to score another victory. He was about to prove to the world that a misunderstood machine, in the hands of the right pilots, could become one of the deadliest fighters of the war.